This week, extreme cold is coming to half of America. And here's what makes this different from any cold snap you've seen before. It's not going anywhere. Sounds impossible? Cold snaps move through. They arrive, they bite, they leave. That's how the weather works. A few brutal days, maybe a week, and then the pattern shifts. Warmer air pushes in. Life returns to normal, but not this time. This time, the cold arrives and settles in like an unwelcome guest who's decided to stay for weeks. Stay with me for the next few minutes because we're going to answer the question everyone's asking. Why is this cold different, and what's causing it to stick around when it should be moving on? You've seen cold snaps before. You remember how they feel. That first morning when you step outside and notice how sharp the cold air feels. The way your car complains when you turn the key. The sound of the furnace running constantly, and the concern about higher heating costs during this period. You know what to expect from a few days of bitter cold. You prepare, you endure, and then it passes. But what if it doesn't pass? What if the cold arrives this weekend, and instead of leaving after a few days it comes back, and then comes back again? What if mid-February arrives and you're still dealing with the same freezing temperatures, similar challenges for your home and budget? That's not a cold snap anymore. That's a pattern. And patterns like this don't happen often. Right now, meteorologists are watching something unfold that has them using words like unusual, persistent, and concerning. They're providing information to help people prepare, but concerning in the way that matters when you're someone who needs to plan your week, protect your home, and take care of your health. Concerning because this isn't following the script that winter weather usually follows. Here's what's happening. Starting this weekend, a massive push of Arctic air is going to sweep across the eastern and central parts of the country. We're talking about temperatures that will drop well below normal for this time of year. Very cold temperatures, the kind that makes going outside uncomfortable and requires extra layers. The kind that requires extra care for older adults and makes outdoor tasks more challenging. But here's the part that changes everything. After that first wave of cold moves through, instead of the usual pattern where warmer air returns and things get back to normal, another wave of cold is going to follow, and then another. It's like watching the same scene play out over and over again, with only brief moments of relief in between. Meteorologists are calling it a repeating pattern. Some are using a reference that anyone who's watched movies in the past few decades will recognize: Groundhog Day. The same cold, arriving again and again, as if the atmosphere hit the repeat button. Now, before we go any further, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and whether you're already feeling this cold or bracing for it. Are you in the path of this? Have you started preparing? Let me know, because we're all watching this together, and your experience matters. While you're here, hit that like button and subscribe if you want to stay informed about what's coming and why it's happening. This is the kind of weather event that affects millions of people, and understanding it makes all the difference. So let's talk about what makes this different. When a typical cold snap hits, there's a rhythm to it. Cold air masses move down from the north, they bring a few days of freezing temperatures, and then the jet stream, the river of air high above us that steers weather systems, shifts. That shift allows warmer air to move back in. The cold moves east, out over the ocean, and temperatures moderate. You might get another cold shot later in the season, but it's a separate event. A new system. This time, that's not what's happening. This time, the cold isn't moving through and staying gone. It's being reinforced. It arrives in waves, with each wave influenced by the current atmospheric pattern over North America. Think of it like this. Instead of one truck delivering a load of cold air and then driving away, it's like that truck keeps coming back. Same route, same delivery, over and over. And the reason it keeps coming back is because of something happening high above us, in a part of the atmosphere most people never think about. But we'll get to that. First, let's talk about what this means for your life, starting this weekend. Because understanding the science is important, but understanding what you're about to face is even more important. When meteorologists say extreme cold, they're talking about temperatures that go beyond uncomfortable. They're talking about the kind of cold that requires you to change how you live, even for a short time. We're talking about morning temperatures that will make you think twice before stepping outside. Daytime highs that won't feel like highs at all. Wind chills that can affect exposed skin quickly without proper protection. This is the kind of cold that tests infrastructure and increases the need for heating systems to work harder. Emergency rooms with people suffering from cold-related illnesses. And it's not just one region. This cold is going to affect an enormous stretch of the country, from the northern plains down through the Midwest, across the Great Lakes and into the Northeast. Tens of millions of people are going to wake up this weekend and feel the sharp edge of Arctic air. If you live anywhere in the eastern half of the country, you're in the path of this, or you're close to it, now. Here's where the Groundhog Day pattern comes in. Let's say this first round of extreme cold arrives over the weekend and lasts through the early part of next week. You'd expect that by the middle of the week, or maybe by the following weekend, temperatures would start to recover. A warm-up, even a modest one, would push in. That's the normal rhythm. But instead, what meteorologists are forecasting is that any break in the cold will be brief and shallow. Temperatures might tick up slightly, just enough to make you think the worst is over. And then another wave of Arctic air drops down. The cold returns, and this cycle repeats. One meteorologist, Ryan Maue, described it perfectly when he looked at the forecast models and saw the same pattern showing up again and again through mid-February. He noted how unusual it is to see this kind of repetition, this lack of meaningful recovery between cold shots. Normally, the atmosphere has more variability. Systems move through. Patterns break down and rebuild into something different. But when something locks into place the way this pattern is locking into place, it means the cold doesn't just visit, it lingers. It becomes your reality for an extended period. And that's what makes this more than just another winter weather event. It's not about surviving a few bad days. It's about adjusting to a pattern that stretches out over weeks. It's about recognizing that your heating system is going to be working overtime, not just for a weekend, but for the better part of a month. It's about understanding that the risks associated with extreme cold frozen pipes, power outages, health dangers aren't temporary concerns. They're ongoing. You might be wondering why the atmosphere would do this. Why would the cold keep coming back instead of moving on? That's the question we're going to answer, and the answer involves something that's been making headlines during winter weather events for the past decade: the polar vortex. But before we dive into that, before we explain what's happening high above the North Pole and why it matters to your daily life, we need to look at what's actually forecast to happen this week. We need to talk about the specifics of this first wave of cold so you know exactly what's coming and when. Because right now, the cold is on its way. It's not a distant threat. It's not something that might happen if conditions align. It's already in motion, and by this weekend, it's going to make its presence known across half the country. So let's break down what that's going to look like, what it means for the places being affected, and why this particular outbreak is getting so much attention from people who study weather for a living. Once you understand what's coming this week, the bigger pattern, the repeating nature of it, the reason it won't leave will make a lot more sense, and you'll be better prepared not just for this weekend, but for the weeks that follow. Let's talk about what's actually forecast to happen starting this weekend. Because if you're going to prepare for something, you need to know what you're preparing for. And this isn't the kind of cold where you just throw on an extra layer and go about your business. This is cold that requires attention, may affect your plans, and benefits from preparation. The setup begins with a southward plunge of Arctic air. This is air that originates over the frozen expanses of northern Canada and the Arctic, air that originates from very cold polar regions during winter months. When that air gets pushed south, it doesn't warm up much as it travels. It holds on to its bitter character, and when it arrives over populated areas, it brings notably cold winter conditions. This particular push is going to start affecting the northern tier of states first, likely around Saturday. Places across the northern plains and upper Midwest are going to feel it first. Then, as the weekend progresses and we move into early next week, the cold is going to spread eastward and southward. By the time we get to Monday and Tuesday, a massive portion of the eastern United States is going to be locked in well below normal temperatures. What does well below normal actually mean? It means morning lows that, in many places, will be the coldest of the season so far. It means daytime highs that struggle to rise above what would normally be considered a nighttime low for this time of year. In some areas, we're talking about temperatures that will spend the entire day below freezing, with no real warm-up even when the sun is at its highest. And then there's wind chill. This is the term you'll hear constantly during an event like this, and it's worth understanding. Wind chill is what the temperature feels like on exposed skin when you factor in the wind. When cold air is moving across your face, your hands, any part of your body that's not covered, it pulls heat away from your skin much faster than still air would. The effect is that it feels colder than the actual air temperature. During this event, wind chills in many areas are going to drop to levels that are not just uncomfortable, they're dangerous. Wind chills can reach levels where proper clothing is essential. Covering exposed skin helps prevent discomfort during outdoor activities. If you're someone who takes a morning walk, who steps outside to get the mail, Who needs to scrape ice off a windshield or walk to your car in a parking lot? These are conditions where you have to think differently. You have to cover exposed skin. You have to limit your time outdoors. You have to recognize that what seems like a quick errand can turn into something more serious if you're not prepared. Now, cold like this doesn't just make people uncomfortable, it stresses everything. Your home's heating system is going to be running constantly, trying to keep up with the demand. Furnaces that normally cycle on and off throughout the day are going to be running for hours at a time. That means higher energy use, which means higher bills. For people on fixed incomes, for retirees who budget carefully, this is more than an inconvenience. It's a financial strain. And it's not just about the furnace. Pipes are vulnerable during extended cold like this, especially in older homes or in parts of the house that aren't well insulated. Water pipes that run along exterior walls, pipes in basements or crawl spaces, even pipes in attics, they're all at risk of freezing. When water freezes inside a pipe, it expands. That expansion can crack the pipe. And when the pipe eventually thaws, you've got a flood on your hands. This is a common problem during cold weather that can be prevented with simple steps. It's preventable, but it requires awareness and action before the cold hits. Your car is another concern. Batteries don't like extreme cold. They lose power, lose efficiency. A battery that's been fine all winter can suddenly fail on the coldest morning of the year. Engine oil thickens when it gets cold, which makes it harder for your engine to turn over. Tire pressure drops. Windshield washer fluid can freeze if it's not rated for low temperatures. If you haven't winterized your vehicle, if you haven't checked your battery or topped off your fluids with cold weather products, this is the week where those small oversights become big problems. Then there's the power grid. When temperatures drop like this across such a large area, electricity demand spikes. Everyone's heating system is running. Everyone's using more power. Utility companies prepare for this, but extreme cold events can still strain the system, especially if equipment fails or if there are other complicating factors like ice on power lines. Utility companies prepare for increased demand during cold weather to maintain reliable service. If you lose power during cold weather, it's important to have a backup plan to stay warm. Temperatures inside a home can drop when power is out, so having blankets and warm clothing available is helpful. So when we talk about what's happening this week, we're not just talking about a number on a thermometer. We're talking about a cascade of challenges. Some are inconveniences, some are expensive. Some are genuinely dangerous, and all of them are more manageable when you know they're coming and you take steps ahead of time. But here's the thing. If this were just a matter of getting through this weekend and into early next week, you'd prepare, you'd endure, and then you'd move on. People deal with cold snaps every winter. It's part of living in much of the country. You don't like it, but you handle it. The difference this time is that handling it once isn't going to be enough. Because what meteorologists are seeing in the forecast isn't just this one outbreak of cold. They're seeing a pattern that suggests the cold is going to return. After this first push moves through, after there's maybe a brief period where temperatures moderate slightly, another wave is coming, and possibly another after that. We're not talking about isolated events separated by weeks of normal weather. We're talking about a procession of cold, one wave reinforcing the next, with the whole pattern persisting well into the middle of the month. This is where that Groundhog Day comparison becomes so fitting. It's not that every single day is going to be identically cold. There will be variations. Some days will be worse than others. There might be a day here or there where temperatures rise a bit and you get a break. But the overall pattern, the repeated arrival of Arctic air, the lack of any sustained warm-up, the feeling that you can't quite get out from under this, that's what's unusual. That's what's making meteorologists take notice. And it raises the obvious question, why? Why is the cold behaving this way? Why isn't the atmosphere doing what it normally does? Which is to shift and change and move weather systems through. What's causing this repetition, this stubbornness in the pattern? The answer to that question takes us away from the surface, away from thermometers and wind chills and frozen pipes. It takes us high into the atmosphere, to a place where most people never think about, but where the weather patterns that affect our daily lives are actually shaped. It takes us to the polar vortex. And once you understand what's happening up there, the pattern down here starts to make perfect sense. So let's go there next. Let's talk about what's really driving this, and why the cold isn't going anywhere. So here's the part that makes this more than just another cold snap. Here's why meteorologists are describing this situation as unusual, and why the comparison to Groundhog Day keeps coming up. The cold that's arriving this weekend isn't a single event. It's the beginning of a pattern that's going to repeat over and over through the middle of the month. And when weather patterns repeat like this, When they lock into place and refuse to budge, it tells you that something bigger is going on. Something in the atmosphere has shifted in a way that's holding this pattern in place. Let's start with what normally happens during winter. Cold air masses move south from Canada and the Arctic. They bring a few days of cold weather. Then the jet stream, the fast-moving river of air high above us that steers weather systems, shifts. That shift allows milder air to move back in from the south or the west. The cold air mass that was sitting over the Midwest or the Northeast gets pushed out over the Atlantic Ocean. Temperatures recover. You might get another cold outbreak later in the month, but it's a separate system driven by a different setup. Winter weather has variety. It changes. It moves. But when a pattern locks in, that variety disappears. Instead of systems moving through and being replaced by something different, the same setup keeps reasserting itself. The jet stream gets stuck in a particular configuration. High pressure and low pressure systems park themselves in certain locations and don't budge. And when that happens, whatever weather that pattern produces just keeps happening. If it's a wet pattern, you get rain or snow day after day. If it's a warm pattern, temperatures stay elevated for weeks. And if it's a cold pattern, like what we're dealing with now, the cold keeps coming back. Ryan Maue, a meteorologist who's been tracking this setup closely, looked at the forecast models and pointed out just how persistent this pattern is. When you look at the extended forecast, you see the same thing showing up again and again. Cold air dropping south, a brief moderation, then more cold air dropping south. The pattern doesn't break. It doesn't evolve into something different, it just repeats. And when you see that kind of repetition in a forecast that extends out into mid-February, you know you're not dealing with a typical winter cold snap. You're dealing with something that's going to define the weather for an extended period. This is what the Groundhog Day metaphor captures so well. In the movie, the main character wakes up every morning to the same day. The same events happen, the same people say the same things. He's stuck in a loop, and no matter what he does, the loop continues. That's what this weather pattern is doing. The atmosphere is stuck in a loop, the same cold air keeps arriving, the same sub-freezing temperatures return. Any break in the pattern is temporary, and then the loop starts again. Now, why does this matter beyond just the inconvenience of dealing with cold weather for longer than usual? It matters because the longer a pattern like this persists, the more cumulative the impacts become. One cold day is manageable. A week of cold is challenging. But when you're looking at multiple weeks of repeated cold, with only brief breaks, the strain compounds. Your heating system isn't just working hard for a weekend, it's working hard for the better part of a month. That wear and tear matters. Your heating bill isn't elevated for one billing cycle, it's going to be elevated continuously. Your risk of pipes freezing isn't limited to a single cold snap, it's present every time a new wave of cold arrives. If you're someone with health issues that are made worse by cold weather, you're not managing that for a few days, you're managing it for weeks. And then there's the psychological aspect. People can endure a lot when they know there's an end in sight. A few days of bitter cold, you hunker down, you deal with it, you look forward to the thaw. But when the cold keeps coming back, when every time you think it's finally over another wave arrives, it wears on you. It changes how you feel about winter. It makes winter feel more challenging than typical seasonal cold. This isn't about being dramatic. It's about acknowledging that prolonged exposure to harsh conditions affects people differently than brief exposure. So the question becomes, what's causing this loop? What's making the atmosphere behave this way? Why is the cold air able to keep dropping south, again and again, without the pattern shifting into something different? The answer lies in the structure of the atmosphere itself, particularly in what's happening high above the North Pole. Most of the time, when we talk about weather, we're talking about what's happening in the lower part of the atmosphere, close to the ground. That's where we live. That's where we feel the wind, the rain, the heat, the cold. But the lower atmosphere is influenced by what's happening in the upper atmosphere, in layers that are miles above the surface. And right now, something has happened in those upper layers that's affecting the entire flow of air across the northern hemisphere. There's a feature in the atmosphere called the polar vortex. You've probably heard the term before, especially during past winter weather events. It gets mentioned in the news every time there's a major cold outbreak. But what is it actually? And why does it matter so much? The polar vortex is a large area of cold air that sits over the polar regions during winter. It's not a storm. It's not a single weather system. It's a circulation pattern. Think of it like a river of air that flows around the North Pole high up in the atmosphere. This circulation acts like a barrier, a boundary that keeps the coldest air bottled up in the Arctic. When the polar vortex is strong, When that circulation is tight and fast, the cold air stays where it belongs up north. The jet stream, down lower in the atmosphere, flows in a relatively smooth pattern. And winter weather in places like the United States is more typical. Cold at times, sure, but nothing extreme or prolonged. But when the polar vortex weakens, or when it gets disrupted, that barrier breaks down. The circulation slows. The boundary that was keeping the cold air locked up north becomes less effective, and when that happens, Arctic air can spill southward. It's like opening a gate. The cold that was confined to the polar regions suddenly has a path to move into areas where it doesn't normally reach, and that's when you get these extreme cold outbreaks. What we're experiencing right now is the result of a disrupted polar vortex. Something happened in the upper atmosphere that caused the vortex to weaken or split. When this happens, the effects don't just last for a day or two. The circulation takes time to recover. The atmosphere doesn't just snap back into its normal state. And while the polar vortex is in this weakened or disrupted state, the pattern that allows cold air to spill south persists. That's why the cold keeps coming back. That's why the pattern is stuck in a loop. The disruption in the polar vortex is holding the door open for Arctic air to repeatedly pour into the lower latitudes. This isn't speculation. Meteorologists and climate scientists have been studying polar vortex disruptions for years. They understand the mechanisms, they know what triggers these events and how they evolve. And when they look at the current state of the atmosphere, they see a classic case of a weakened polar vortex leading to persistent cold outbreaks across the mid-latitudes. It's not a mystery, it's a well-understood process. It's just not something that happens every winter, which is why when it does happen, it gets attention. So now we have the full picture of why this cold is different. It's not just about the intensity of the cold that's arriving this weekend. It's about the fact that the atmospheric pattern driving that cold is stuck. The polar vortex disruption is keeping the loop going, and until something changes in the upper atmosphere, until the polar vortex re-strengthens and that barrier gets re-established, the pattern down here at the surface is going to keep repeating. This is where understanding makes a difference. When you know that this isn't a typical cold snap, when you know that the pattern is likely to persist, you can plan accordingly. You can prepare your home not just for one cold weekend, but for an extended period of below normal temperatures. You can adjust your expectations. You can check on vulnerable neighbours or family members more than once. You can budget for higher heating costs. You can take the threat of frozen pipes seriously every time a new wave approaches, not just during the first outbreak. And you can stop wondering why the cold won't go away, because now you know. It's not bad luck. It's not an exaggeration. It's the result of a specific atmospheric setup that's holding this pattern in place. And understanding that gives you the ability to respond intelligently, rather than just reacting day by day. So let's take that understanding and apply it to what this means for your daily life, because knowing the science is valuable, but knowing how to live through this pattern is what really matters. We need to talk about the polar vortex, not because it's a dramatic term that sounds alarming, but because it's the key to understanding everything else. It's the reason the cold is coming back again and again. It's the mechanism behind the Groundhog Day pattern we just described. And once you understand what it is and what's happened to it, the entire forecast starts to make sense in a way that it didn't before. Let's start with what the polar vortex actually is, because there's a lot of confusion about this term. It gets thrown around in the news every time there's a major winter storm or cold outbreak, and sometimes it's used incorrectly. People imagine it as a single storm system that wanders around causing chaos. That's not what it is at all. The polar vortex is a permanent feature of the atmosphere during winter. It's always there, hanging sitting over the North Pole. It's a large-scale circulation of air high up in the stratosphere, which is the layer of atmosphere that sits above where most weather happens. This circulation flows in a counterclockwise direction around the pole. Picture a massive spinning wheel of cold air miles above the surface, centered over the Arctic. That's the polar vortex. When it's strong, when that circulation is tight and fast, it acts like a container. It keeps the coldest air bottled up in the Arctic, where it belongs. The edges of the vortex form a boundary, and that boundary helps steer the jet stream down lower in the atmosphere. When the polar vortex is doing its job properly, the jet stream flows in a relatively smooth west-to-east pattern across the mid-latitudes. Winter weather in places like the United States is normal. You get cold periods, sure, but they're not extreme, they come and go, the pattern has variety. But the polar vortex isn't always strong. Sometimes it weakens, sometimes it gets disrupted, and when that happens, everything changes. A disruption to the polar vortex typically starts with something called a sudden stratospheric warming. This is an event where the temperature in the stratosphere high above the North Pole suddenly rises. We're not talking about a small increase. We're talking about temperatures that can spike dozens of degrees in just a few days. This warming is caused by waves of energy that propagate upward from the lower atmosphere. These waves disturb the circulation of the polar vortex. They slow it down, they can even split it into 2 or more pieces, and when the circulation slows or breaks apart, the vortex loses its strength. It loses its ability to contain the cold air. What happens next is that the cold air that was trapped over the Arctic starts to spill outward. The boundary that was keeping it in place is no longer effective. The jet stream, which had been flowing smoothly, becomes more wavy, more contorted. Instead of keeping Arctic air locked up north and milder air to the south, the jet stream starts to allow those air masses to mix. Cold air pushes south into areas where it doesn't normally reach, and that's when you get these extreme cold outbreaks across the mid-latitudes. This process doesn't happen overnight. A sudden stratospheric warming event takes time to develop, and it takes even longer for its effects to filter down through the atmosphere and influence the weather at the surface. Typically, you'll see a sudden stratospheric warming occur, and then a week or 2 later the effects start showing up in the forecast. The polar vortex weakens, the jet stream becomes more erratic, and cold air starts pouring south. That's exactly what's happened in this case. In mid to late January, a stratospheric warming event was confirmed by meteorologists. This event began developing in early January and reached its peak intensity by late January. The polar vortex weakened, and now we're in the period where those effects are manifesting at the surface. The cold air that's arriving this weekend, and the cold that's forecast to keep coming back through mid-February, is a direct result of that disruption. Now here's the important part. When the polar vortex is disrupted like this, it doesn't just snap back to normal in a day or 2. The atmosphere has momentum. It takes time for the circulation to reorganize, for the vortex to strengthen again, for the jet stream to settle back into a smoother pattern. During that recovery period, which can last for weeks, the pattern down at the surface remains stuck. The door stays open for Arctic air to keep pushing south. And that's why we're seeing this repeating pattern of cold. Think of it like a river. When a river is flowing normally, water moves downstream in a predictable way. But if something happens upstream, if there's a dam break or a landslide, the flow gets disrupted. Water backs up in some places, rushes forward in others, and it takes time for the river to settle back into its normal flow pattern. The atmosphere works the same way. When something disrupts the circulation in the stratosphere, the effects ripple through the entire system, and it takes time for everything to reorganize. So when meteorologists look at this pattern and say it's likely to persist into mid-February, they're not guessing. They're basing that on their understanding of how long it typically takes for the atmosphere to recover from a polar vortex disruption. They're looking at the current state of the stratosphere, at the circulation patterns, at the jet stream configuration, and they're seeing a setup that's not going to resolve quickly. This also explains why the cold is coming in waves rather than one sustained, unbroken stretch of frigid temperatures. The polar vortex disruption creates favourable conditions for cold air to spill south, but it doesn't mean cold air is constantly flowing in a steady stream. The atmosphere still has day-to-day variability. There are still other weather systems moving around, so what you get is a wave of cold air that pushes south, lingers for a few days, and then retreats slightly. But because the overall pattern is still disrupted, because the polar vortex is still weak, another wave follows, and then another. The individual waves might be separated by a day or 2 of slightly milder weather, but the overall pattern, the repeated arrival of Arctic air, continues. This is why the Groundhog Day metaphor is so fitting. The pattern repeats because the underlying cause hasn't changed. The polar vortex is still disrupted. The jet stream is still in a configuration that favours cold outbreaks. And until something shifts in the stratosphere, until the vortex begins to re-strengthen, the pattern at the surface is going to keep doing the same thing. Now you might be wondering whether this is something new. Is this happening more often? Are polar vortex disruptions becoming more common? It's a fair question, especially given how much attention these events get. The short answer is that polar vortex disruptions are not new. They've been happening for as long as the Earth has had an atmosphere with a polar vortex. Scientists have been studying them for decades. They happen, on average, a few times per decade. Some winters see disruptions, others don't. It's part of the natural variability of the atmosphere. What has changed is our awareness of them. The term polar vortex entered the public consciousness in a big way during a massive cold outbreak that happened several winters ago. People started paying attention. The media started using the term, and now Whenever there's a significant winter weather event, the polar vortex gets mentioned. That increased awareness is a good thing. In some ways, it helps people understand what's driving these events, but it can also create the impression that these events are new or unprecedented, when in reality they are a known feature of how the atmosphere behaves. What matters more than whether these events are becoming more common is understanding how they work and what they mean for the weather you're about to experience. And now you have that understanding, you know that the cold arriving this weekend isn't just a random weather event, it's connected to a disruption in the polar vortex. You know that the repeating pattern isn't bad luck, it's the result of the atmosphere being stuck in a particular configuration. And you know that this pattern is likely to persist until the polar vortex recovers, which probably won't happen until we get deeper into February or even into early March. That knowledge changes how you approach the next few weeks. It means you're not just preparing for one cold weekend, you're preparing for a pattern. You're making sure your home is ready to handle repeated waves of cold. You're checking your heating system, insulating vulnerable pipes, making sure you have supplies on hand in case of power outages or other issues. You're planning your schedule with the understanding that there are going to be multiple periods where being outside is uncomfortable or even dangerous. And if you have vulnerable family members or neighbours, people who are elderly, people with health conditions, people who live alone, you're checking on them regularly, not just once. This is what understanding the science gives you. It gives you the ability to plan. It gives you context. It takes away the mystery and replaces it with information you can act on. And that's powerful, because it means you're not at the mercy of day-to-day forecasts that seem to keep saying the same thing. You know why they're saying it, and you know how to respond. So now that we understand the mechanism, now that we know what's driving this pattern and why it's persisting, let's talk about what it actually means for your daily life. Because understanding the polar vortex is interesting, but what really matters is how this translates into the challenges you're going to face, the decisions you're going to have to make, and the steps you need to take to protect yourself, your home, and the people you care about. That's where we're going next. Now let's bring this back down to ground level. Let's talk about what this pattern actually means for your daily life. Because understanding the science is valuable, but what you really need to know is how this affects you, your home, your budget, and your health over the next few weeks. When you're dealing with a single cold snap, you can power through. You turn up the heat, you stay inside as much as possible, you make sure you're dressed warmly when you do have to go out. It's uncomfortable, maybe expensive for that week, but it's temporary. You know there's an end in sight. But when you're dealing with a repeating pattern like this, when the cold keeps coming back multiple times over the course of several weeks, the impact compounds. It's not about surviving one bad weekend. It's about managing an extended period where normal life is harder, more expensive, and more risky than usual. Let's start with your home. Your heating system is going to be working harder than it has all season. During a typical winter, your furnace cycles on and off throughout the day. It heats your home to the temperature you've set, then shuts off until the temperature drops again. But during extended cold like this, especially during the most intense periods, your furnace is going to run almost constantly. It's going to be working to keep up with the heat loss from your home as that bitter cold air outside pulls warmth away from your walls, your windows, your roof. That constant running means wear and tear. It means higher energy consumption, and it means a heating bill that's going to be noticeably higher than normal. If you're on a fixed income, if you budget carefully, this is something you need to plan for. It might mean cutting back on other expenses to cover the cost. It might mean reaching out to local assistance programs if you need help paying your bill. Many utility companies and community organizations have programs specifically for situations like this. Don't wait until the bill arrives and you're in crisis. Plan ahead, and your furnace isn't the only thing at risk. Pipes are a major concern during extended cold. Water pipes that run through unheated spaces, basements, crawl spaces, attics, exterior walls can freeze if temperatures stay low long enough. When water freezes inside a pipe, it expands. That expansion can crack the pipe, and when temperatures eventually rise and the ice thaws, you've got water pouring out of that crack. This is one of the most common and most expensive problems that happens during severe cold events. The damage can be extensive, and it's not always covered by insurance. The best defense is prevention. If you have pipes in vulnerable areas, let faucets drip slightly during the coldest periods. Moving water is less likely to freeze. Open cabinet doors under sinks to let warm air circulate around pipes. If you have a basement or crawl space, make sure it's not so cold that pipes are at risk. And if you're going to be away from home, don't turn your heat off. Keep it set high enough to keep the interior of your home above freezing, even if no one's there. Now let's talk about your car. Cold weather is hard on vehicles, and extended cold is even harder. Your car's battery loses power in cold temperatures. A battery that's been fine all winter can suddenly fail on the coldest morning of the season. If your battery is more than a few years old, this might be the event that pushes it over the edge. It's worth having it tested before the worst of the cold hits, and replacing it if it's weak. Engine oil thickens in cold weather, which makes it harder for your engine to turn over. Using oil rated for cold temperatures can help your vehicle perform better in winter. Tyre pressure drops as temperatures fall, which affects your handling and fuel efficiency. Check your tyres regularly during this period, and make sure your windshield washer fluid is rated for low temperatures. Regular washer fluid can freeze in the reservoir or on your windshield, and that's dangerous when you need clear visibility. Then there's the issue of simply being outside. During extreme cold, especially when wind chills are involved, exposed skin can develop frostbite in minutes. Old temperatures can affect exposed skin, especially on fingers, toes, and face. Numbness and skin colour changes are signs to go indoors. Wearing gloves, hats, and covering your face helps prevent cold-related discomfort. This isn't a scare tactic. This is the reality of what happens when human skin is exposed to extreme cold for too long. If you have to be outside during the worst of this, if you need to walk to your car, if you're shoveling snow, if you're doing any outdoor tasks, cover as much skin as possible. Wear layers, wear a hat, gloves, a scarf that covers your face, and limit your time outside. Do what needs to be done and get back inside. Don't underestimate how quickly the cold can become dangerous. For people with certain health conditions, cold weather creates additional risks. People with heart or respiratory conditions should consult their doctor about managing cold weather. Cold air may affect these conditions, so limiting exposure and dressing warmly is helpful. If you're in one of these groups, take extra precautions. Limit your exposure to the cold. If you must go out, breathe through a scarf to warm the air before it reaches your lungs. Pay attention to how you feel, and don't push yourself. And then there's the strain on infrastructure. When temperatures drop across such a large area and stay low for an extended period, the power grid is under stress. Everyone's using more electricity to heat their homes. Utility companies prepare for high demand, but equipment can still fail, especially in extreme cold. Power outages during cold weather events are more serious than outages at other times of year, because without heat, your home can become dangerously cold within hours. If you lose power, you need to have a plan. Know where you can go if your home becomes too cold. Have blankets, warm clothes, flashlights, and battery-powered or hand-crank radios on hand. Never use gas stoves or grills indoors for heating, as this can create unsafe conditions. This repeating pattern also means you need to think about fatigue. One cold weekend is manageable. But when you're dealing with wave after wave of cold, when you're constantly worrying about pipes, constantly running your heat at high levels, constantly bundling up just to walk to the mailbox, it wears on you. Especially if you're older, if you live alone, if you already struggle with winter. The psychological toll of prolonged harsh conditions is real. It's not weakness. It's the natural human response to stress that doesn't let up. So what do? You pace yourself. You don't try to tough it out alone. You check in with neighbours, with family. You accept help if it's offered. You give yourself permission to acknowledge that this is hard, that it's more than just normal winter weather. And you remind yourself that it won't last forever. Patterns do eventually break. The polar vortex will recover. Spring will come. But in the meantime, you manage what's in front of you with intelligence and care. This is also a time to think about community. If you know someone who's vulnerable, someone elderly, someone with health issues, someone who lives alone and might not have family nearby, check on them. A phone call matters. An offer to pick up groceries matters. Making sure they have heat, that they're not trying to save money by keeping their house too cold, that they know there are resources available if they need help, all of that matters. These extended cold events are when communities either pull together or when people slip through the cracks. Checking on others during cold weather helps build stronger communities. So that's what this pattern means for daily life. It means higher costs, more vigilance, more preparation, and more attention to both your own well-being and the well-being of those around you. It's not insurmountable. People have dealt with extended cold before and they'll deal with it again, but it requires a different mindset than dealing with a brief cold snap. It requires recognizing that this is going to be part of your reality for a while and planning accordingly, and now that you know what you're dealing with, you're in a much better position to do exactly that. So let's look at how this compares to past events, because context matters, and understanding where this fits in the larger picture of winter weather can help you calibrate your response appropriately. You're not imagining it. If this cold pattern feels familiar, if it's triggering memories of past winters when something similar happened, you're remembering correctly. This isn't the first time the polar vortex has disrupted and sent waves of Arctic air pouring into the lower latitudes. This isn't the first time people across a huge swath of the country have had to deal with extreme cold that just wouldn't leave. And looking back at those past events, understanding how this compares, what was similar, what's different, gives us valuable context for what we're facing now. The term polar vortex became widely known during a major cold outbreak in the winter of 2013-2014, when it entered mainstream media coverage. That was the year when a massive cold outbreak gripped much of the United States, and the term started showing up in headlines everywhere. People who'd never heard of the polar vortex before were suddenly seeing it explained on the evening news. That event was dramatic. Temperatures plummeted across the Midwest and Northeast. Wind chills reached dangerous levels. The cold lasted for days, and in some places it came back multiple times over the course of several weeks. If you lived through that winter, you remember what it was like. Schools closed, businesses shut down. People were told to stay indoors unless absolutely necessary. There were stories of pipes bursting, of cars that wouldn't start, of heating systems that couldn't keep up. The cold was relentless, and it dominated the news cycle for weeks. That was many people's first real encounter with what a disrupted polar vortex can do, but that wasn't the only time it's happened. Another significant polar vortex event occurred in 2019. That one hit the Midwest particularly hard. There were places where temperatures dropped so low that they were colder than parts of Antarctica. Wind chills reached levels that were genuinely life-threatening. Again, schools and businesses closed. Again, people were warned to stay inside. And again, the cold came in waves, with the worst of it lasting for more than a week. In February 2021, a notable winter event occurred. That event was different in some ways because it extended further south than usual. The cold reached deep into Texas and the southern plains, areas that aren't accustomed to dealing with extreme cold and don't have the infrastructure built to handle it. The power grid in Texas experienced significant challenges. Many people were without electricity during cold temperatures, highlighting the importance of infrastructure preparedness. That event was a stark reminder that when Arctic air pushes into places that aren't prepared for it, the consequences can be severe. So when we talk about the current pattern, the cold that's arriving this weekend, and likely to persist through mid-February, we're not talking about something unprecedented. We're talking about something that fits into a pattern of similar events that have happened multiple times over the past decade or so. This is part of the natural variability of winter weather in the Northern Hemisphere. Polar vortex disruptions happen. They've always happened. They're a known feature of how the atmosphere works. But even though these events aren't new, each one is different in its details. The intensity varies. The areas most affected vary. The duration varies. So how does this current event compare to those past ones? In terms of intensity, this event looks to be significant, but probably not quite as extreme as some of the worst past events. The coldest temperatures forecast for this weekend and into early next week are going to be harsh, no question. But we're not seeing forecasts for the kind of record-shattering cold that occurred during the 2019 event, where some places set all-time low temperature records. This is more in line with what happened in 2014, very cold, dangerous at times, but within the range of what these events typically produce. Where this event really stands out is in its persistence, the repeating pattern. The way the cold is forecast to keep coming back through mid-February is more similar to 2014 than to some of the other events. In 2019, the worst of the cold was concentrated into a shorter period. It was incredibly intense, but it didn't last as long. In 2014, the cold came in multiple waves over several weeks, which is much closer to what we're expecting now. So if you lived through that winter, what you're about to experience might feel very familiar. The geographic extent of this event is also similar to past polar vortex disruptions. We're looking at a huge area affected the Midwest, the Great Lakes, the Northeast, and portions of the South. That's typical for these events. When the polar vortex weakens and Arctic air spills south, it doesn't just affect one small region. It affects a massive swath of the country. That's what makes these events so impactful. They're not localized weather phenomena, they're continental-scale patterns that affect tens of millions of people simultaneously. Now, one question that often comes up when people experience multiple polar vortex events over a period of years is whether these events are becoming more frequent or more severe. It's a natural question, especially in the context of broader climate discussions. The research on this is complex and ongoing, but here's what we know. Polar vortex disruptions are not a new phenomenon. They've been occurring for as long as we've had records, and they almost certainly occurred long before humans were around to observe them. They're part of the natural dynamics of the atmosphere. The frequency of these events varies from decade to decade. There are periods when they happen more often, and periods when they happen less often. That variability is normal. Some research has suggested that a warming Arctic might influence the behaviour of the polar vortex and the jet stream in ways that could make certain types of winter weather patterns more likely. The idea is that as the Arctic warms faster than lower latitudes, the temperature contrast between the Arctic and mid-latitudes decreases, which could weaken the jet stream and make it more prone to developing the kind of wavy pattern that allows cold air to spill south. Other research has found less evidence for this connection, or has suggested that the relationship is more complicated than a simple cause and effect. The scientific community is still working to understand these connections, and there's no consensus yet on whether polar vortex disruptions are happening more often now than they did in the past. What we can say is that when they do happen, we notice them more. We have better forecasting tools, we have more media coverage, we have social media amplifying people's experiences, so even if the frequency hasn't changed, our awareness of these events has increased dramatically. For the purposes of understanding what you're about to experience, though, the most important point is this. Events like this have happened before, multiple times in recent memory. People have lived through them, communities have managed them. The challenges are real, but they're not insurmountable. You have the advantage of being able to look back at how past events unfolded, what worked, what didn't, and apply those lessons to the current situation. If you remember the winter of 2014, you remember what it took to get through multiple waves of extreme cold. You remember the importance of preparation, the value of checking on neighbours, the relief when the pattern finally broke. If you remember 2019, you remember how intense cold can be when it's at its worst, and how important it is to take warnings seriously. If you remember 2021, especially if you live in an area that was affected, you remember how critical infrastructure can be when it's stressed beyond its limits, and why having backup plans matters. All of those memories, all of those experiences are relevant now. This is the same type of event. It's driven by the same atmospheric mechanism. It's going to create similar challenges, and the strategies that work then are the strategies that will work now. Stay informed, prepare your home, check your heating system, protect your pipes, look out for vulnerable people, don't underestimate the cold, and remember that even though patterns like this can last for weeks, they don't last forever. The polar vortex will eventually recover, the jet stream will settle back into a less chaotic pattern, milder air will return, and when that happens, this period of repeated cold will become just another memory, another winter event that you lived through and moved beyond. But until that happens, you're dealing with what's in front of you, and knowing that others have dealt with similar situations before, and that this is part of the normal range of winter weather variability, helps put it in perspective. It's not the end of the world, it's a challenging weather pattern that requires attention and preparation, and you're more than capable of handling it. So now let's talk about the outlook when this pattern is likely to break, what signs to watch for, and what the transition out of this might look like. So here's the question everyone wants answered. When does this end? When does the cold finally leave and stay gone? When can you stop worrying about frozen pipes and heating bills and dangerous wind chills? It's a fair question, and it deserves an honest answer. The honest answer is that patterns like this don't end abruptly. They don't flip like a switch from extreme cold to spring warmth. They fade, they gradually weaken. And the timeline for that process is measured in weeks, not days. Based on what meteorologists are seeing in the extended forecast models, and based on what we know about how polar vortex disruptions typically evolve, the repeating pattern of cold is likely to persist into mid-February. That doesn't mean every single day is going to be equally cold. There will be variations. Some days will be worse than others. There will be brief periods where temperatures moderate slightly, where you get a day or two that feels almost normal, but those breaks are going to be temporary. They're not the end of the pattern, they're pauses within the pattern. Think of it like this. When a polar vortex disruption is at its peak, when the circulation in the stratosphere is at its weakest, the door is wide open for Arctic air to pour south. That's what we're experiencing right now, and what we're going to experience through the next couple of weeks. But as time goes on, the stratosphere begins to recover. The circulation starts to strengthen. That door begins to close, slowly. As it closes, the frequency and intensity of the cold waves decrease. Instead of a new wave arriving every few days, there might be a week or more between waves. Instead of the cold being as intense as it was earlier, it's a bit less severe. This recovery process is gradual. It happens over the course of several weeks, and during that time you'll see the pattern shifting. Early February is likely to feature the most persistent cold, multiple waves, with only brief breaks in between. As we move into the middle of the month, those breaks might become a bit longer. The cold waves might be a bit less intense. By late February, you might start seeing longer stretches of more typical winter weather, with only occasional shots of colder air. But here's the complicating factor. Even as the polar vortex begins to recover, even as the overall pattern starts to shift, there's still going to be variability. Winter weather doesn't just smooth out into perfect predictability. There are other factors at play: smaller scale weather systems, day-to-day fluctuations, regional differences. So you might see a forecast that shows a warm-up coming in mid-February, and you might think, finally this is over. But then a few days later, another cold shot comes through. That doesn't mean the pattern hasn't changed. It just means that the transition out of a pattern like this is messy. The most realistic timeline for sustained improvement for the kind of weather where you can confidently say the worst is behind you is late February into early March. By that point, the polar vortex should have re-strengthened enough that the repeated waves of Arctic air stop. The jet stream should settle back into a pattern that's more typical for late winter. And even if you still get cold days here and there, because it's still winter after all, they'll be isolated events rather than part of a persistent pattern. That's a long time to wait if you're in the middle of dealing with this. If you're watching your heating bill climb, if you're tired of the cold, if you're worried about your pipes or your health, being told you have to manage this for another month isn't what you want to hear. But knowing the realistic timeline is better than false hope. It's better than thinking the pattern is over after the first brief warm-up, only to have the cold return and feel blindsided by it. So how do you know when the pattern is actually breaking? What are the signs to watch for? There are a few things that indicate the polar vortex is recovering and the pattern is shifting. One sign is the extended forecast. When meteorologists start seeing forecast models consistently show a change in the overall pattern, not just a day or two of milder weather, but a sustained shift toward more typical temperatures, that's a good indication. Another sign is what's happening in the stratosphere itself. Meteorologists monitor the polar vortex directly. They track its strength, its shape, its temperature. When they start seeing signs that the circulation is re-strengthening, that's a leading indicator that the pattern at the surface is going to change soon. You can also watch the jet stream. When the jet stream is in a highly amplified pattern, when it has deep troughs and big ridges, when it's allowing cold air to plunge far south, that's a sign the polar vortex is disrupted. When the jet stream starts to flatten out, when it returns to a more west-to-east flow, that's a sign the polar vortex is recovering. Meteorologists talk about this all the time in their forecasts. If you're following weather discussions, listening to what they're saying about the jet stream pattern will give you clues about where we are in this process. And then there's just the calendar. As we move deeper into February and approach March, the sun gets higher in the sky. Days get longer. Even if the polar vortex is still disrupted, even if cold air is still trying to push south, there's a limit to how long it can overcome the increasing strength of the sun. Spring is coming, no matter what the atmosphere is doing. By early March, even if the pattern hasn't fully broken, the cold just doesn't have the same punch it had in early February. That's the natural cycle of seasons, and it's more powerful than any single weather pattern. So what should you expect in practical terms? Expect that the next couple of weeks are going to be difficult. Expect repeated cold waves, with only brief breaks. Expect high heating bills, ongoing concerns about pipes and health and safety. Expect to be tired of winter by the time this is over, but also expect that this won't last forever. Expect that by late February, you'll start to see real improvement. Expect that by early March, the worst will be behind you. And expect that by the time spring truly arrives, this will be a memory, an unpleasant one, maybe, but just a memory. In the meantime, don't let your guard down during those brief warm-ups. When temperatures moderate for a day or two in the middle of this pattern, don't assume the cold is gone. Keep your preparations in place. Keep checking on vulnerable people. Keep monitoring the forecast. Those warm-ups are pauses, not endings. The pattern is still active until the polar vortex fully recovers, and don't be discouraged if the timeline shifts. Extended forecasts are less certain than short-term forecasts. What looks like a pattern change 2 weeks out might shift when we get closer to that date. The general trend toward gradual improvement through mid to late February is likely to hold, but the exact timing of when things improve and how quickly might vary from what's forecast today. That's just the nature of weather forecasting at extended ranges. The key is to stay informed, stay prepared, and stay patient. This is a marathon, not a sprint. You're not trying to survive one bad weekend. You're managing an extended period of challenging weather, and the people who handle that best are the ones who pace themselves, who don't exhaust their resources or their energy in the first week, and who maintain their vigilance throughout the entire period. So that's the outlook. The cold is here, and it's going to stay in one form or another through mid-February. Late February into early March is when sustained improvement is most likely. And by the time spring truly takes hold, this will all be behind you, but between now and then, you've got work to do. You've got preparations to maintain, you've got people to check on, and you've got yourself to take care of. So let's wrap this up with a clear summary of everything we've covered and a reminder of what really matters as you head into the weeks ahead. Let's bring this all together because we've covered a lot of ground, and it's important to walk away from this with a clear understanding of what you're facing and what you need to do. Here's what we know. Extreme cold is arriving across much of the eastern and central United States starting this weekend. This isn't a typical cold snap that comes and goes in a few days. This is the beginning of a repeating pattern that's likely to persist through mid-February. The cold will arrive in waves, one after another, with only brief breaks in between. Some days will be worse than others, but the overall pattern, the repeated arrival of Arctic air, the lack of sustained recovery is going to define the weather for the next few weeks. We know why this is happening. The polar vortex, that circulation of air high above the North Pole, has been disrupted. That disruption has weakened the boundary that normally keeps the coldest air locked up in the Arctic. As a result, that air is spilling south, again and again, in a pattern that's stuck in place. Until the polar vortex recovers and re-strengthens, which takes time, the pattern at the surface is going to keep repeating. And we know what this means for your daily life. Higher heating bills, risks to your pipes, your car, your health. The need for ongoing vigilance, ongoing preparation, ongoing attention to both your own safety and the safety of those around you. This is more than an inconvenience. This is a weather pattern that requires active management. It requires taking steps to protect your home and yourself. It requires checking on vulnerable people. It requires recognizing that the challenges of this week aren't going to disappear next week, they're going to continue in one form or another for a while. But here's what's also true. People have dealt with patterns like this before. This isn't unprecedented. This isn't beyond what communities across this part of the country can handle. You have the information you need. You understand what's causing this. You understand how long it's likely to last. And you understand what you need to do. That puts you in a position of strength, not helplessness. So what do you need to do right now? Make sure your home is ready. Check your heating system. If your furnace hasn't been serviced recently, consider having it looked at before the worst of the cold hits. Protect your pipes, let faucets drip during the coldest periods. Keep cabinet doors open to let warm air circulate. Make sure vulnerable areas of your home aren't getting too cold. Stock up on supplies in case you lose power or can't leave your home for a few days. Make sure you have flashlights, batteries, blankets, non-perishable food, and water. If you're someone with health conditions that are made worse by cold weather, talk to your doctor if you need to. Make sure you have your medications. Make sure you have a plan for how to manage your condition during extended cold. Don't put off these conversations. This is the time to address them, and look around your community. Who do you know who might be vulnerable? Who lives alone? Who's elderly? Who might not have family nearby to check on them? Reach out, make a phone call, offer to help, make sure they have heat, that they're not trying to save money by keeping their house too cold, that they know there are resources available if they need assistance. Many communities have warming centres, utility assistance programs, and other resources specifically for situations like this. Make sure the people who need those resources know about them. Cold weather is a good time to check on neighbours, especially those who live alone. A simple phone call can make a difference in helping someone feel connected. And take care of yourself, not just physically, but mentally. Acknowledge that this is hard. Acknowledge that prolonged harsh weather is draining, that it's more than just normal winter inconvenience. It's normal to find extended cold weather challenging. Remember that weather patterns change, and this one will too. This is temporary. The pattern will break. Spring will come. You've gotten through difficult things before, and you'll get through this. Now, before you go, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. Are you in the path of this cold? Have you already started feeling it? Or are you bracing for what's coming? What are you most concerned about as you head into the next few weeks? Let me know. We're all navigating this together, and your experience matters. And if you found this information valuable, if understanding what's happening and why it's happening helps you feel more prepared, hit that like button. Subscribe to this channel so you're ready for updates if the pattern shifts or if there's new information you need to know. Share this with anyone you think might benefit from understanding what's coming. The more people who are informed, the better everyone is able to prepare. This is the kind of weather event that affects millions of people. It's going to dominate the news for the next few weeks. You're going to hear a lot of different voices, a lot of different explanations, a lot of different predictions. Some will be helpful, some will be sensational, some will be confusing. But you now have a solid foundation of understanding. You know what's driving this. You know how long it's likely to last. You know what it means for you. And that knowledge is power. It's the difference between feeling like you're at the mercy of forces you don't understand and feeling like you're equipped to handle what's coming. So take that knowledge, use it, share it, and take care of each other. Check on your neighbours, help where you can, ask for help if you need it. This is how communities get through challenging times together, not alone. The cold is coming, and it's going to stick around for a while. That's the reality. But reality is manageable when you understand it, when you're prepared for it, and when you're not facing it alone. You've got this. Your community has this. Before long, this cold pattern will pass, and we'll move into milder weather as we progress through late winter. Stay safe, stay warm, stay informed. And remember, weather patterns are temporary, and the preparation and community support during challenging times are valuable. So let's get through this together. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.